Okay, welcome to my first video post. These hopefully going to give me a chance to talk in a little bit more detail around the science of endurance. And so I'm calling this series One Rant, One Deep Dive, and One New Study. The idea is I'm going to post one of these videos a week. Will be on a short rant on whatever topic I've been ranting about to my wife during the week around science and endurance. A deep dive into a topic, hopefully, that you can use to help your performance or inform your performance and your fueling around performance, potentially in this case. And then a new study that I found interesting. And so today's rant is going to be about creatine and electrolytes. Then the deep dive is going to be on carbohydrate metabolism. And I'm going to leave the study to the end. So like I say, hopefully this is a chance for some slightly more long-form content for those of you that are interested in the details of these kind of things. And I'm happy to cover any topics, so please drop me a comment if there's any topics you'd like me to go into in a bit more detail. The idea is that I'll be talking about topics on here before I go onto Instagram, before I go onto TikTok, so you'll get an idea of what's coming up on my channels as well. So to start with, what have I been ranting about this week? And so I've been inundated with Instagram and TikTok ads this week for combinations of creatine and electrolytes. And so creatine is the most well-studied supplement, particularly within strength performance, but more research coming out now within endurance performance. I've changed my position on creatine recently when it comes to recommending it to endurance athletes. And I think there's probably a decent role for creatine in recovery, potentially sprint finishes as well. But there's this move by companies to combine creatine with electrolytes. Now, the reason behind this, the concept is that creatine is absorbed through sodium glucose transporters. And so you may be improving the ability of our body to transport and store creatine by combining it with electrolytes. And this is a classic case of science washing, where there's an element of truth that is taken to the extreme to try and sell something, but actually it's of no relevance to the everyday person. So there is data to suggest that electrolytes can speed up how quickly you saturate your creatine stores when you start taking creatine. The problem here is that once you've saturated your creatine stores, you no longer store any more creatine. And so those electrolytes might be useful for the first 3 days of consuming creatine, and then they become irrelevant. And actually, if you're going to max out your creatine stores maybe 1 day earlier, well, that's going to make no difference in the long term when you're taking creatine for months and months or years and years. So if you see a company selling creatine plus electrolytes, they're doing it so they can make more money. It's a USP for companies that they can use and they can take advantage of, but it's giving you no performance benefit at all. So just buy creatine monohydrate, saving yourself money, and you're getting no performance benefit if you're consuming it alongside electrolytes. Ran over. The deep dive is something I've been talking about a bit more recently on my channel because I've been having to dive into it for my literature review for my thesis, and that is the role of carbohydrate on muscle and liver glycogen. So a little background. We store carbohydrate as glycogen in the body, and we store it mainly in the muscle, but also in the liver as well. So about 400-ish calories in the liver at any given time, whereas we've got 1,600 calories of carbohydrate roughly in the muscle. Again, big variations, but just as a ballpark. And the liver, its main role is to continuously supply glucose into the bloodstream. So liver's keeping our glycemic levels topped up in the blood. Which means obviously in the blood that glucose is going around to the muscles, fueling our muscles' work. And so we're constantly putting a bit of blood from the liver back into our blood glucose to keep our blood glucose levels fairly stable. The question then comes into endurance exercise. What are we doing for carbohydrates, or what are we trying to get out of taking carbohydrate? Now, for a long time, the idea has been you consume carbohydrate to slow down the degradation of glycogen in the liver and the muscle. So you slowly use that carbohydrate from your muscle and from your liver, and you take carbohydrate so you can burn that carbohydrate you've consumed rather than burn the carbohydrate you've got in your muscle and your liver. The problem comes when you look at more recent data on actually whether carbohydrate can help you spare muscle glycogen. And it's a really mixed story. So for context, this isn't an anti-carbohydrate post. There's good evidence that liver glycogen is spared by carbohydrate ingestion. And so there are benefits to carbohydrate through helping maintain your liver glycogen concentrations and therefore helping maintain your blood glucose levels. But when we look at muscle glycogen, it's a bit more complicated. There's a couple of studies, particularly Gonzalez et al. 2015, so researchers down in the University of Bath, that showed 102 grams of carbohydrate an hour had no impact on muscle glycogen concentration during exercise, 3-hour exercise bout. It did slow down the decline in liver glycogen. You do, however, have a few studies over up in Leeds Beckett by a guy called Andy King, some brilliant studies that suggested that there was an impact of carbohydrate on muscle glycogen. So it did slow down that decline. But the decline is much slower than that of liver glycogen. And that really seems to be what the research suggests, is that you can slow down your loss of muscle glycogen, but it's a small effect, whereas the liver effect is a lot bigger. So the benefit of carbohydrate comes much more from sparing liver glycogen stores than it does from muscle glycogen. This also becomes even more relevant when you look at that trend towards really high carbohydrate intake, because that same researcher, Andy King, showed or demonstrated that increasing your carbohydrate above the amount that you could absorb at the intestinal level sped up the use of muscle glycogen. So consuming too much carbohydrate can actually speed up how much muscle glycogen that you use, which sounds paradoxical, because if you've got more carbohydrate coming in, why would you use more from your muscle? But that is what they've demonstrated. I wonder if there's some kind of signaling effect. That carbohydrate that you're using or that you're consuming that's in excess just gets stored and used in the gut, so it doesn't transfer into the blood. So I wonder if there's some kind of signaling there between the gut and the brain that is kind of suggesting an abundance of glycogen. But it's an interesting finding, and one of the main reasons why I think, at least in sub-elite athletes, you should not be consuming, certainly not be consuming more than 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. I think there's a good argument to suggest that you don't need to be at that level anyway, but certainly not above that. It could actually make your performance worse. So that was a deep dive. Finally, the study that has caught my eye this week, and so this is an interesting one and relates to all sports, really, particularly team sports or sports where decision making is important. When you think about it, and this is something I've sort of looked into for a while now, because decision making and the impact of nutrition on decision making isn't a particularly well studied area, but it's so important. If we think about team sports in the most obvious example, if you're playing football, you're playing rugby, you're playing netball, whatever it might be, and you're in that fatigue state, often decision making is worse. And so if you have a method of maintaining or slowing down that decline in decision making, well, if you're making a better decision in the 90th minute of a football match, well, that's clearly a good thing. And so this study that I'm looking at the moment combined caffeine and theocrine and looked at whether that theocrine itself helped decision making when taken alongside caffeine. They looked at it in a military context where obviously it's important to make correct decisions, and they found benefits to this co-ingestion of caffeine and theocrine, which to me is a fantastic example of not wanting to base anything on one study, but there's no real downside to adding theocrine to your caffeine. So it seems like a fairly easy, fairly low cost and low downside option to potentially improve decision making. Now, where's that beneficial? Well, I mentioned team sports. Obviously, the military is a prime example, which is what that study was in. But even in endurance performance, I think if we think about decision making during ultra marathons or even in marathons, late in a marathon, the ability to get your pacing right or to know when to kick, any of these kind of things is going to potentially impact your performance. And so I think there's a good argument that decision making is an underlooked aspect of supplementation. I've researched it looking at exogenous ketones, and that's where I really began being interested in it. But this study here suggests, that caffeine plus theocrine could potentially enhance it. It was 300 milligrams of caffeine with 150 milligrams of theocrine. So these are all things I'm going to talk about on my social medias this week. But like I said, this kind of longer format, I say longer form, is going to be 10 minutes long. Slightly longer form is a nice way of going a bit more deeply into it and allowing me to get my morning rants out of the way. So I hope this is interesting. I'm going to make this a regular weekly thing where I discuss whatever's been coming up throughout the week, having a rant and going deep into some physiology. So this might be something that no one cares about, in which case I'll stop doing it. But if it's something that people find interesting, slightly longer form, without any editing, without any cutting, then please let me know, because I enjoy talking. It's why I talk on Instagram and TikTok so much. And the hardest bit is always editing. So hopefully this is of interest to people. If there are topics you'd like me to cover in the next few weeks, then please just drop me a comment. Really open to new topics at the moment, particularly. So I wonder if this will do well. Please let me know if you've got any feedback, positive or negative. I'll be more than happy to not do this if no one wants to listen to it. Although if you're still listening now, then I'm taking that as a positive. So thank you for listening. We'll see how this goes, and goodbye.